It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce you to David Starkey and Mark Littlewood.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much. That's most kind. And
Dear God.
blimey. Well, this is most kind as well.
This is the Sorcerer's Apprentice.
You clearly wish us to be incoherent by the end of the evening.
Yes.
That's all right. We'll manage. I'm just going to check. Can you hear me at the back? Loud and clear, right? Good. David, do you just want to say hello to see if they can hear you at the back as well on your microphone?
I will try and be as rude as possible. Okay.
Excellent.
Audible? Yes. Good. Thank you.
Superb. So, Matthew, thank you for that introduction. I much prefer David's introduction to my own, I think it has to be said. I don't know what went down worse, that I support Southampton Football Club, that I used to work for the Liberal Democrats, or that I studied at Balliol College, Oxford. I mean, this is quite a
ruinous.
long...
It's ruinous.
There's quite a long crime sheet. But let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, how this is going to go. I'm going to do a very short advert at the start. Not really an advert, but just to set the scene for the sort of things we're going to discuss. And for about 40 minutes or so, I'm going to fire some questions to the man on my left, who I consider without doubt to be the foremost conservative public intellectual in Britain today, and someone whose ideas I think are not going to just shape the next government, but are going to completely reset and restore how Britain is governed. So I will be interviewing David for a while and prodding him a little. Then we'll have about 40 or 45 minutes for you to ask your questions. We'll take questions pretty much on anything. So start to allow those to percolate through your mind whilst I'm asking David questions. But I wanted to tell you a little, Matthew was very kind to tell you a little about the organisation I've set up, which is called Popular Conservatism. Not Popular Conservatives, Popular Conservatism, interested in conservatism. And we were set up just under 2 years ago. In February 2024, I launched this venture. And I launched it really to pose and hopefully answer a question that I thought was an extremely important question for everybody in Britain to answer, but particularly those who saw themselves as being on the right of centre of politics. Why was it, and you've got to bear in mind that this was six months before the general election, but it seemed obvious the Conservatives were going to lose and lose badly. Why was it that after 14 years of Conservative government, 2010 to 2024, a pretty long stretch for any party to be in power, why was it, as we approached the fag end of those 14 years, had Britain not become more conservative in any way whatsoever? Whatever metric you cared to pick, it seemed that we had not become more conservatives. Tax had gone up to its highest level in peacetime. Public spending had gone up to its highest level ever. Debt had gone up. Public debt had gone up to its highest level ever. We were indulging all sorts of strange leftist fantasies around carbon net zero and what is a woman. Traditional liberties like freedom of speech seem to be in a considerably worse state than they were in 2010. It seemed to me that if you'd taken a snapshot of the United Kingdom in 2010 and a snapshot of the United Kingdom again in 2024, and that's all the information you had to go on, you would probably conclude, based on that information and that information alone, that we had been governed by a woke, left-wing, socialist-leaning government for 14 years, yet the Conservative Party had been in charge for all of that time. Why might that be so? I asked myself. I was scratching my head about it. And I thought I had a few ideas to solve that conundrum, to begin to answer that question, but the gentleman on my left gave me easily the most compelling answer, and that's why over the past, now nearly 2 years, I've been working with him to try and refine the answers to those questions and to go out and spread that message. So, David, I'm greatly in your debt for what you've done intellectually here. So that's why we set up the organisation. If you aren't yet a member of it, you don't have to pay at all. Just go to popularconservatism.com, our website. Please do sign up. We have a whole array of WhatsApp groups, surveys, regular Zoom meetings. If you're interested, just tomorrow evening, in fact, you can all log on to, for me to be in conversation over a Zoom call with Jonathan Gullis, a former Conservative MP who's recently defected to Reform. So that's what we're about, and that's why I'm sitting here with David. And I hope that we can educate, inform, excite, and possibly irritate you a little bit over the next hour and a half. Now, David, you're the historian, you're the brains, the intellect behind our mission. And so I usually start by asking you to sort of go right the way back to, well, if not the Magna Carta, perhaps the Civil War or the Glorious Revolution or Robert Peel or Benjamin Disraeli, and to put it in a historical context. But because we haven't seen each other for a few weeks owing to the Christmas break, I actually want to start by just asking you, by bringing it up to sort of my subject, modern politics. What's your audit of Britain today in January 2026? Everybody seems somewhere between furious and disillusioned. We have the most unpopular government since opinion polling began, even though it has only been in power for 18 months. How bad is the present politics, economics, culture of the UK here in early January 2026?
Gosh. I think the only answer, alas, has got to be very bad. That I think what is most extraordinary is how amazing all of this is. We had a general election last year in July, which delivered what British general elections are supposed to. A clear verdict of the people, apparently. We returned a government with, you're the one with these facts and figures at your fingertips, a majority of
174, I think
174, practically unheard of. I think it's bigger than Blair ever.
Just about the same.
It's the same as Blair. And yet, even at the time, there were niggles, weren't there? Because we all did a little bit of calculation. You were one, I was another. And we noticed that, of course, they didn't actually get all that many people voting for them. That, in fact, Jeremy Corbyn did very much better in terms of absolute numbers. We again looked at the fact, if I remember correctly, they got about
34% of the vote in Britain.
34%. And at the same time, only about 60% turned out.
That's right.
So in other words...
1 in 5 people voted Labour.
In other words, if you put those two figures together, only 1 in 5 people voted for the Labour government. But nevertheless, it was a sweeping majority. And you had Starmer, who had been lambasting the previous Conservative prime ministers, had been denouncing their stupidity, their corruption, their incompetence, who seemed about to steam into Downing Street with confidence, decided to recruit the senior enforcer in the civil service, Sue Gray, whom we'd all become familiar with as this kind of weird combination of Northern Irish publican and public school headmistress. It's a very, or maybe just a dominatrix. Anyway, this extraordinary figure who had sort of, dare one say, pussy whipped poor Boris, who I think probably was rather unused to that exercise, but there we are, as his enforcer. And it fell to bits within weeks. So what we've got, I think, is an indication we're not dealing with an ordinary government, we're not dealing with ordinary politics, we're not dealing with an ordinary collapse. What we've got is something that's actually gone visibly, manifestly, and possibly irreversibly wrong with actually how we are governed. Mm-hmm. This is what makes it new. This is what makes it profoundly dangerous and what makes it profoundly difficult. If you go back to Margaret Thatcher, if you go back to 1979, when you had a really violent change of political direction, the British state was capable of carrying it through. If you go back to, if you go back, in fact, to Tony Blair in 1997, even after Thatcher, the British state was capable of delivering. You now have this complete paradox. You have somebody like Keir Starmer who believes in the world that we're in. He believes in law. He believes in regulation. He believes that everything should be done by proper rules. He's got a clear majority, and yet he can't do anything. So I think what we've got to explain is how this stasis, this failure of government, connects with all the other failures.
Yes.
Connects with the economic failures, the broader failures of policy, the failure of citizenship, the failure we were hearing in the introduction, the crisis in the understanding of our history, the collapse of business confidence. When I came here today, I think this is probably the first time I've actually walked in Bournemouth, I'm ashamed to say. And I had a vision of this terribly proper and genteel place. And the first thing that happens to me is, well, we did have a visit from the late lamented Peter Whittle, who made a film on immigrant crime here. We've just set up a vigilante corps, and we're terribly sorry that the building opposite this is falling down. And by the way, all the shops are crap, and we don't illuminate the gardens. And so big and small.
Yeah. Tell the same story.
They tell the same story. And what I think we should be trying to do this evening is to begin with the real core analysis of what I think, again, a word that people hesitate to use, because again, ladies and gentlemen, we were talking about something else. We were talking about the fact that on a wet and miserable evening in January, 150 of you bothered to turn out to something that won't have sparklers. I shall not be wearing a blue jumpsuit like Andrea Jenkins, and I have absolutely no sequins on my person and whatever. And you've come to hear a serious, detailed discussion. Things are changing. People want answers. They want analysis.
Yeah. So, David, this is what I want us to dive into. That, I think overwhelmingly there's a view that Britain is broken, at least suffering. As Matthew said in his introduction, some people believe it is beyond repair. I very much hope that is not the case. We can perhaps ridicule our Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
We should.
And we should.
We should.
But your take on this, which I think I was edging towards before I even met you and discussed it, but has now solidified the view in my mind, is this isn't really about the personnel. This isn't really about Keir Starmer's hopeless and Rachel Reeves can't add up, and actually they're even worse than the Tories, who are terrible themselves. Something bigger is going on, right? You mentioned Labour wins this massive majority and apparently sort of does nothing with it. It hasn't really taken any, huge, big, bold decisions. It's just dialed up tax, which you'd expect the Labour government to do, dialed up debt, which you'd expect them to do. And you have a theory, which is now, I think, in public discourse starting to be known as the Starky thesis, about what went wrong. So whilst we should ridicule our politicians, obviously, and whilst we should hold them to account, this is a much bigger problem than our last 6 or 7 prime ministers haven't been up to the job, or our last 4 or 5 chancellors haven't understood economics. There's actually a system problem here that you think's been going on for the best part of 30 years. Explain in simple terms what that thesis is. That it's the personnel may be hopeless, but even if they were geniuses, they would find themselves in a system that isn't going to work anyway.
Well, I think what we've got to do first is to go back actually to your opening gambit about Britain being notably less conservative after 14 years of Conservative government. This paradox. I think we've got two sets of problems, and this, again, of course, is a meeting held under the aegis of one of the consequences of that failure of conservatism, namely the rise of the Reform Party. I think we've got a double problem, one with conservatism itself, and the very ideas of conservatism and the nature of the Conservative Party. And then we've got another one with the actual way we're governed, which again, we can summarize with another word beginning with C. So we've got problems with conservatism and problems with the idea of the Constitution. And when I talk about the Constitution, I don't just mean subclause 4, whatever. I mean using it in the same way that you do when you talk about somebody's constitution. When you say they've got a good constitution, you mean broadly they're in overall health. And it's that sort of approach that I want to adopt. Let's just for the moment part the business of the particular problem and difficulty with the very idea of conservatism, and let's look at what's gone wrong, your 30-year, this long brewing 30-year crisis. And again, it is going back to that moment, and we've already mentioned it, when I did the comparison in terms of size of a majority, we take the touchstone Tony Blair in 1997. Now, I think you and I had very different reactions to that. You, I remember saying you were quite relaxed about it. I remember the election night 1997 vividly because I spent the latter part of it with my head down a lavatory after consuming...
Over-celebrating?
After drinking my sorrows in rather good vintage champagne, but that's another matter. It was that kind of party. I had an intimation, I had a sense that something was going to go wrong, but I didn't put my finger on it. And you know what? I didn't really put my finger on it until 3 or 4 years ago. So again, it's really important to understand, if you feel that you're puzzled, that you don't know what's gone wrong, join a club. Very few people, in fact, I can think of nobody, who actually really sussed out just what had happened.
But can I just say, this is fascinating, because you're even saying your reaction, although you felt sort of in your waters, in your bones, that something was going to go awry. I felt wholly relaxed. I didn't vote for Labour.
Well, he said...
But I kind of thought, the Labour Party's become sensible. I don't need to
They've adopted
Thatcherism.
They've adopted Thatcherism and whatever. And you see, that was exactly what happened. Blair continued broadly with Margaret Thatcher's economic policies. Indeed, he actually, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, even committed himself to the spending
of the Conservatives,
the broad fiscal balance of the last Conservative Chancellor. But they did something else. They decided. Do you remember Blair with the all stop and all of that? He decided, and we all laughed our heads off. Well, I didn't, but most people did, to make us a new country. Cool Britannia. We all thought it was a metaphor. Ladies and gentlemen, Blair actually carried out a slow burn French Revolution in Britain with exactly the same principles that destroyed France at the end of the 18th century. He introduced them into Britain. And they had a single common principle. Blair, with all his affectations of populism, of his being a man of the people, the people's princess, all of this stuff, Blair, like most people of the left, fundamentally distrusted the people, fundamentally distrusted any kind of popular role in politics, and in particular the parliamentary process and the process of parliamentary elections. And what Blair did, there's a single key theme. He removed power from Parliament, despite the fact that he commanded these enormous parliamentary majorities. He said, I don't trust the people, and I don't trust the people elected by the people. And instead, he moved power in two radically different directions. On the one hand, and this was signalled very clearly in their manifesto, you may remember, it's your kind of area, politics, philosophy, and economics. One of the first things that Gordon Brown was committed to was setting up the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England.
And making the Bank of England independent.
The so-called independence of the Bank of England, its ability to set interest rates by a committee of experts, a committee of experts that the government could appoint, but whose decisions it could not change. And ladies and gentlemen, what we do from that point onwards is to multiply these bodies. They're given a special name. They're called quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. And we have over 400 of these things, and they command roughly 1/3 of public expenditure, and you can do absolutely nothing about any of the decisions you take, and you do not influence in any way directly who is appointed to them. And I know, in one sense, and I mean, look at the bodies. You've got English nature. Now again, isn't it sensible that we have experts like Tony Juniper? Isn't it a good thing? And well, yes, but you know, it does lead directly to, do you remember the little curious incident when we've been trying, which we've been doing for a very long time, and at the cost of vast amounts of money, to build HS2, and you come across an area where there's the odd bat or two. And in order to deal with these bats, which, you know, I'm sure are terribly important, we spend, ladies and gentlemen, £100 million constructing a bat tunnel. For that price, you could build 3 bat Ritz hotels and give each bat a personal butler. Again, when we're trying to build, which we are doing not very successfully, when you're trying to build a new large-scale, water-cooled atomic power station, we've now created a fish disco at the cost of £600 million to prevent fish overheating. This is insane. What is the thing that connects the two? It is if you give a group of experts, single-issue experts, the remit to pursue their policy to the utmost, they will come up with daft decisions. And if we look in area after area, climate change is another one. And what's even better, we've got a real model. We were actually ruled like this during COVID. And look at what they called themselves. Sage, you know, like Aristotelian philosopher kings, all coming down to tell us poor little people what you should do. And what's the problem? I mean, after all, Plato, one of the two great sages, one of the two great philosophers of the ancient world, and remember, people go on a lot about Christianity as being the origin of our politics. I don't see this. All our language of politics is Greek and Roman. But Plato believes passionately that government should be by experts. The other side, of course, is Aristotle, and I'm an Aristotelian, and who said government is like a meal. The expert judge of a meal, well, he isn't an expert. It's not the cook who judges the meal, it's the eater. And that should be the right way round. Or, as was beautifully put by two very great men, they actually dispute the origin of the phrase Theodore Roosevelt in America or Churchill in England, that you want your scientists, they're the archetypical experts, you want them on tap but not on top. During COVID, we had the scientists on top. And they gave us crazy decisions. You decide for an illness, which frankly, you know, wasn't all that serious. Do we all remember what the average age of death from COVID was? 82. What's the average age of death? 81. Get COVID, live longer. You know, it's completely... And to do that, what did we do? We decided, because we didn't want anybody to die of COVID, we would turn the NHS from a health service into a COVID service. So it didn't matter if you died of a heart attack. We certainly weren't going to do anything about it. Or of cancer. Cancer care has received a desperately dangerous hit as a result of that. We sacrificed the education of 3 generations of school children. We incur debts on the scale of a medium-sized war. And above all, what we do is, with furlough, we remove the habit of work. We give people the habit of being paid for nothing. So that's the reward of single-issue expert government.
David, I want to really...
Just one finish. It is the worst way of doing anything.
Yeah.
You need experts, but the judge as to how much policy costs, what other things you have to sacrifice for it, they have to be made by the politician, they have to be made by people who answer directly to you.
Because crucially, that involves generalists who make trade-offs, right?
That's right.
That, on the one hand, I want to... I'm all in favour of saving bats if we want to, but on the other hand, I've got to look after taxpayers' interests.
Do you want to spend 100 million doing it?
So that would have... I mean, I don't know if HS2 will ever be completed, but the cost of the bat tunnel, even on the government's own estimates, is it will cost us £500,000 for each bat life saved. This is unbelievable. But obviously...
By the way, do you know how much we value your life when it comes to drugs?
About 70,000, is it?
No, between 20 and 30.
Between 20 and 30,000. We won't let new drugs onto the market to save humans. So I totally get your point, David, that it comes out that way. And we should be unsurprised. If we employ people whose only job is to save bats, and that's all they care about, you would expect these crazy narrow decisions. But what I'm interested in is sort of the process of how we sort of got there. So I can remember, I think it was about the time I was finishing university, Francis Fukuyama wrote this book suggesting we had reached the end of history. This was just after the Soviet Union had fallen. That's it. Liberal democracy has basically won. Nothing else interesting is really going to happen in the history of humanity. That's it, guys. There'll be a few tweaks and changes, but the game's up. The battle of ideas has been...
Therefore, get technocrats to
Therefore,
run
get
it.
technocrats. That it should be uncontroversial that we like bats or want to save the panda or want to save the planet from climate change or want to achieve any other... Don't want people to die of COVID, don't want people to die from, drink driving, smoking cigarettes, you name it, give any particular problem. That these were no longer part of a wider battle of ideas because the big battle of ideas had been won. Sort of Western liberal democracy had defeated Soviet communism. And therefore it was just now a matter of rounding errors, just how you turn the dial, a bit of a notch here or a notch there. No big debates to be had.
You see, there's a simple trick. It assumes that the ends of the people who care about bats and those who care about climate change and those who care about historic buildings and those who those who care about transport are all compatible with each other. And they're not. They all fight each other. And the only way you can reconcile them is by exactly the thing that Fukuyama said was over, which is by debate, which is by the political process. And you see, what is so terrible, ladies and gentlemen, we invented the political process. I mean, that's what our parliament is about. We set this model to the world, and we've abandoned it, and we abandoned it under the leadership of arguably our most popular politician. And for me, there's a genuine sense, and I know that many people feel this on a whole range of issues, there's a genuine sense of both kind of national amnesia and national suicide, that we've forgotten, remember, it's hard to believe, until very recently we were the model of how you governed yourself. Which is why virtually every country in the world has this funny thing with an Anglo-Norman name, a parliament, because we set the model. But under the influence of these modish notions that I've just been referred to, we threw it away. And then the other thing is, which is the other side of the Blair story.
I just wait before we move on to the judiciary, because I really want to tease out a bit more about these quangos.
Forgive me, sorry.
Because I'm going to move on to the other area we've bled out to in a minute, and that's probably even worse. But what I'm fascinated about, and I'm speaking for the audience here, maybe I've got them wrong, is that you were saying after your, too many glasses of vintage champagne and not feeling too well about yourself in May 1997, you nevertheless had a sense or a feeling that things were going to go wrong. But it's quite easy to get these expert committees off the ground, isn't it?
Oh.
You know, so it's and you mentioned in one of your earlier points, David, it's like a slow burn revolution.
It is a slow burn.
They're just one committee, one group, one new independent arm's length body on any particular subject. It's like the boiling frog thing. You don't really notice any given one.
Yeah.
But in accumulation, you suddenly look back after 25 years and think, actually, Parliament doesn't really run the country anymore.
That's right. But you see, it's also worse because I've been presenting this in black terms, deliberately in black terms, but it also ties in with other very good features of British and particularly English life, which is the importance of charities, of bodies like the National Trust and whatever, and whatever it's called, that looks after the name, the initials, NSPCC or whatever, all of those kind of things.
Protection of children.
We've got a really, really good tradition of this. But what's happened is the whole thing has become a kind of, we were talking about this when this wine, thanks to Mark, wouldn't stop coming. I used the phrase of the sorcerer's apprentice. We've kept on multiplying these things. And what's happened particularly with David Cameron's Big Society, the charities now feed into the corresponding regulatory body. So you get a kind of unholy alliance between charities which I support, like the Georgian Group, like the 20th Century Society, all feeding themselves into English heritage, all putting ever further and further limitations on what can be knocked down, what can be rebuilt, freezing further towns, and so on like this. Again, all the charities that deal with animal rights, welfare and whatever, all empowering English, all empowering English nature, and so on. And so what you do, you set up a society which is simply, ladies and gentlemen, we've regulated ourselves to death. But it's also one, again, over the Christmas holiday, there was the extraordinary and memorable case of this deplorable Egyptian activist, the Alaa El Fattah, who apparently everybody in Britain wanted to welcome into Britain, although he puts at the head of every single tweet he ever made, "I hate the British, I think they are responsible for all the ills of the world," and all the rest of it. But every non-governmental organisation was campaigning for this man. So the thing is like a sorcerer's apprentice. But it's got no centre, it's got no focus, it's got no single purpose, and they all fight each other. But the most conspicuous thing about all of these bodies is the lack of a single focus, is the lack of any clear notion of a national interest. And ladies and gentlemen, this is why our government seems to be fighting itself.
There's only 500 different specialised interests,
there are five.
whether it's
we have
COVID
five.
or bats or Egyptians in prison.
Do you know what? We used to be a country which eliminated what were called baronies, what were called, dear me as a historian, palatinates, self-governing bodies. We eliminated these things. We suppressed feudalism. We are in a kind of neo-feudal state of all these expert bodies, charities, NGOs. I mean, the body you were, Liberty, all pursuing separate policies, all rendering any kind of single state policy completely impossible, because finally, and this will lead us into where we should be going next, they can also invoke law.
Yeah. So to paraphrase that, what we've seen, even though it was slow and steady and any particular move might not have frightened the horses, from 1997 onwards, we see power given away from Parliament and our elected representatives into this endless morass of 400 plus quangos, expert committees on everything, whether it's bats or fish discos or COVID or God only knows what else, that are basically running the day-to-day politics. And it's not surprising you don't know it, because it's not as if they turned the furnace up to 100. It was just one soft layer at the time, and you only see the scale of it if you look back on it. So our democracy bleeds out in one way through our left arm in that direction. But there's another direction in which British democracy has bled out from the other side of our body, which you're even more worried about, in which Parliament and democracy has lost even more power out of the other side of this body, and that's the law, the judiciary, how we frame the law. Tell us about that, and tell us about what went wrong there. Was that also a slow burn, or were there 2 or 3 crucial inflection points?
There are two or three crucial moments. There's the actually the beginning of the Blair Brown governments, and at the end. The first is 97-98, the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights, and then the Equality Act at the end, and within the middle, the Constitution Act, which is responsible for the quasi-abolition of the office of Lord Chancellor and the creation of the Supreme Court and whatever, none of which the ECHR was prefigured in the manifesto, none of the others were. These crept up, often for quite narrow reasons of political calculation, like getting rid of the Lord Chancellor, Derry Irving, or something like that. But again, they have this common feature, the central feature, and why, again, we were so well governed. Our government and our entire constitution had a single focus, the idea of Parliament. What was the power of Parliament? Well, it was going right back to, in fact, you mentioned, going back to Magna Carta, going right back to Magna Carta, about which I published a very good short book, which you should all buy, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Going right back to Magna Carta, you developed this idea of a representative body, which, again, it's unique in Europe, in which the whole nation is represented. The king, the lords, the bishops, the abbots, and the people of the shires and the people of the towns. In other words, everybody. And it's that universal representation which means that a law passed by Parliament, parliamentary statute, binds everybody. And it's unique to Britain. It's why we can raise taxes we can do. It's why you can impose law and order with the effectiveness that we used to. I know you've forgotten how to do it in Bournemouth, but that's another matter. Anyway, what Blair does is fundamentally to undercut that. And in fact, to replace the sovereignty of Parliament with the rule of law, which actually really means the rule of lawyers. And what we've got to understand is, again, we talked about it being done by subterfuge. I think when we move into this area, we're looking at something else. And it's something we really do, all of us on the right. And if there is to be a reform government, if we are to see a decisive realignment of our politics, it's something we're going to have to think about. The left has been incredibly good at capturing language. What could be nicer than human rights? Why on earth am I complaining about human rights? They're lovely, aren't they? I call them, they're sort of Paddington Bear political philosophy, aren't they? You know, you can see it with a little squidgy hat on, you know, little luggage label, you know, all sweet and old-fashioned and brown manila with a shaky pencil hand saying Peru, little battered leathered suitcase. And, you know, everybody goes, particularly the women there, I say, everybody goes, ah. But ladies and gentlemen, what's the problem with a European Declaration of Human Rights? What's the problem with universal human rights? Well, I think there are 2 problems. The first is that you express them in complete generalities. A right to family life. Ladies and gentlemen, what the bloody hell does that mean? It means any judge can determine anything as a right to family life. It's not how we, even sillier, is a one-word act of Parliament, equality. What on earth do you mean? You know. Anyway, so there's a problem of simply legislating by extremely loose general statements. Our tradition of law is completely the opposite. But you know, ladies and gentlemen, there's a much more fundamental one. Think about it. If there are universal human rights, it means, doesn't it, there's a universal human being. It means there's no history, there's no tradition, there's nothing specific to any country. It means that the newly landed immigrant, those charming folk who come into one of your 5 hotels, washed up a little bit, given a new tracksuit, cleaned his fingernails, and he's just like you and me, isn't he? Behaves in just the same way that we do. There's absolutely... But we don't believe that, really, do we? But, ladies and gentlemen, our law does. Our law does. And if you want to see the logical conclusion of this, look at the Green Party's manifesto section on citizenship, in which it says there should be no frontiers, that there should be no such thing as a foreigner and as a native. That's the logical conclusion.
But what I'm interested in here, David, is that one might lament that being the political position of the Green Party or the political position of the government.
Of our law?
But why? How has that become it? How has the law or human rights law or the judiciary become more powerful? I mean, why is it different now to a similar problem or an identical problem arising in the 1970s or the 1980s?
Because you incorporate the European Convention. And the European Convention has laws like saying there's a right to family life.
Right.
There are these extraordinary abstractions. And of course, an abstraction can be interpreted exactly as a judge wants. So you've done that. But you've done something else. The incorporation took place against an extraordinary series, a kind of legal revolution. And it was a legal revolution. At least that was the result of a decision by Parliament. Parliament takes that decision that it will, as it were, authorise judges to do this. And it's very interesting if you go back and you look at the drafting of the convention, you look at the fact that in 1951, as everybody says, we were the first country to ratify it. We've now looked at the public records of the time. The Lord Chancellor at the time, this was the Labour, the dying days of the Attlee government, the Lord Chancellor at the time, a man called Lord Jowett, said, this is a catastrophe.
The European Convention.
This is the European Convention. Under no circumstances should we ratify this. It goes back to the worst days of Chancery when the law varied to the length of the Lord Chancellor's foot. What does the Foreign Office say? This is 1951. Oh, we can't say no. It would look bad. People will think that we are not leading the moral discourse. By the way, we agree it's an absurd document, but we don't think anybody will take it seriously. Those were the bases on which we signed this damn thing.
They would have used, if they had the term at the time, they would have said it would be bad optics not to sign the document.
It's exactly what, and it's the Foreign Office saying it. They say, oh, we've got a moral duty.
So having done it for those, assuming that wouldn't be a problem, we now find that decisions, am I right in this, that would previously have been political, contentious, between the Green Party and the Conservative Party, or the Labour Party and Reform, are now no longer fought in that arena. They are fought in courts.
They're fought in courts. And the problem is that the judges operate on a principle which puts public safety right at the bottom of the list. This is the problem. That is against the right of the individual, because you can see why. For the judge, the notion of the right in hearing an individual is again like the business of the expert.
Yep.
This is what he's concerned about. The idea of public safety is remote from that, is a secondary consideration. It will be first in the eyes of a politician, it's way down the list.
So he's considering a specific case. Here I've got this specific man in front of me who's complaining that his child doesn't like Albanian chicken nuggets, wasn't that one case?
And isn't this absolutely definite?
And therefore I'm going to, rather than him considering an aggregate case
That's
about
exactly
what
right.
our overall asylum and immigration policy
should be. You see, it's
should
worse than that, because the great power and driving force was a legal revolution carried out without any form of public consultation or debate, and led by one particular lawyer, a man called Tom Bingham, who was the last senior law lord before it's all rejigged and made into the Supreme Court. And Bingham argued for a different view of law. He really reinvents the idea of the rule of law, effectively meaning that the lawyers are the final judge of the social
Above Parliament.
They're above, well, alongside, but morally above.
Right, so a parallel system.
It's a parallel system. He also does something else. He is completely explicit, admittedly in Australia, it was probably safer there. He's completely explicit on the driving force of human rights law. And listen very carefully. This is the man who is its principal supporter. He says, human rights law, by definition, is anti-democratic. It's counter-majoritarian, and it favours minorities above the majority. And he lists the minorities it favours, and they begin with the mentally sick. There's no accident about Rudakabana. There's no accident about Kalokane.
These are protected people.
These are protected people. And the law leans over itself to protect them. Or gypsies. Again, gypsies are mentioned. And this is what has happened. So
that ends equality under the law.
Well, yes, in fact, I would go further. We do now have an explicitly two-tier system of justice in which, you know, you're even lower down than I am because I at least can claim to be gay. But you know,
as a straight white baptised in the Church of England man, I'm finished.
You really are the pebble under everybody's foot, and it is an absurdity. It is an absurdity, but there we are. And again, all of this has gone into an ever-broadening stream, because to that we then added the removal of the office of Lord Chancellor and the creation of the Supreme Court. Now, everybody said the Supreme Court is simply a renaming.
A rebadging.
A rebadging. It wasn't. The very fact you call it supreme, the very fact that you couple it with the ECH, with the incorporation of the ECHR, the very fact you couple it with this new notion of the rule of law, you see judges operating with a degree of impunity and aggression that they would never have dared to have done
above Parliament.
Well, and against Parliament. I mean, again, the flamboyance of somebody like Brenda Hale, the wearing of the spider badge, and that extraordinary business.
This was over prorogation.
Over the prorogation of Parliament. That directly undercuts the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And then finally, the insanity of the Equality Act. Ladies and gentlemen, many of you will have noticed, I hope, that we haven't yet talked about the problems with the Conservative Party, but we should do that at some point. But you will remember the thing that opened the way to that last great triumph of the Conservative Party was the winter of discontent in 1979. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, to these revolutionary laws that we've been talking about, our second city, Birmingham, is in a state of permanent winter of discontent, even in high summer. It looks exactly as Britain did in 1979. And the reason is the Equality Act. That one act of Parliament is responsible for two of the most extraordinary instances of misgovernment in Britain. To the one that doesn't directly relate to Birmingham, it's responsible for the whole fuss about transgenderism, because the Equality Act, in its 9 protected characteristics, has got gender on the one hand and sex on the other, and the two, of course, are completely incompatible, so they fight with each other. But the other thing that's extraordinary about the Equality Act, this is an act of Parliament passed by a British Parliament. It includes, ladies and gentlemen, equations. And what the equations are designed to do, and you did, going back to your degree again, we've referred to the economic bit before, we'll refer to it again. These equations are designed to enable judges to apply one of the most ludicrous theories in all economic history, Marx's labour theory of value, that labour has got an intrinsic value as opposed to the value of the market.
Yep.
And what that act has done is to enable Birmingham to be bankrupted, because judges now set wages. This is sillier than anything that happened in the 1950s or 60s with prices and incomes board. So in other words, what we've done, we've effectively expertised policy in one direction and we've legalized it in another. And the two groups, of course, work together.
So I've got, on the one hand, if I want to build a railway or something like that, I've got English nature and bat problems and newt problems, and it's going to cost me a fortune. On the other hand, if I've got a view about how to kickstart the economy, I've got judges telling me exactly how much I've got to pay somebody who works as a cleaner compared to somebody who works in a warehouse,
or
for
indeed,
example.
how much a child under special needs should be paid.
Yeah,
this is
these
an
are
insanity.
Now judicial, right?
It's an insanity.
So essentially, what's happened is the political democratic sphere has shrunk. Matters that should have been contests between politicians or different political parties, that arena is now a tiny five-a-side pitch rather than a huge arena, whereas most of these decisions are taken around committee decisions or judicial decisions. Just on the judicial side, because this is quite contemporary, can you tell me, what is international law and should I care about it?
What is international law? International law, well, there are two forms. The old view of international law, it was things like the law of war. That's to say, wars only end when one party wins and another party loses, but the party losing admits that it's lost. Which is why the war will never end in Gaza until the Gazans admit defeat. It's very simple. So that was the old view, the Grotius view of international law, and the fact that treaties should be kept and so on. The new view of international law is a strong one, in which the body of conventions and whatever, basically going back to the creation of the United Nations in 1945 and all the attendant bodies on that, operate as a quasi-objective system of law. And you do indeed have an international court of justice, which of course has no formal sanction behind it, apart from a moral sanction. We've created the new thing, the International Criminal Court. So there's a very powerful body of opinion, very much associated with the world of Fukuyama and whatever that you were talking about, that effectively wants to pretend that we have a world government with a world system of law, and states are really just the equivalent of parish councils and should follow the law. And what you see, of course, is people with an academic or a legal interest in this tend to get very, very excited about it. And we, ladies and gentlemen, have the terrible misfortune of a government that believes righteously in this at exactly the moment when it has been blown up as a nonsense by Donald Trump.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask.
And, we are committing suicide. It is a complete absurd. To claim that international law says we have to give the Chagos Islands back and actually pay them for the privilege of taking them, at the same time that Donald announces the Donroe Doctrine and waltzes into Caracas to sort of rendition, isn't it, or whatever. They have Americans, are very fond of using 45 words where one will do to rendition out Maduro. The absurdity, the contradiction is absolute. But ladies and gentlemen, just quickly, there's another much more important point. We can laugh at it, but the trouble is we've persuaded ourselves in Britain that if we play the game according to the rules, that will be enough, that we don't need power, that we don't need military force. And ladies and gentlemen, we are naked to our enemies. We can posture as much as we like about the Ukraine or about what Donald does. And because we've armed forces, which used to be amongst the best in the world, and are now a pasteboard mockery.
Yeah.
We cannot put do you know what? We cannot even put properly a decent battalion into the field, much less a brigade.
So this is fascinating, David, because you're suggesting that actually we're quite close to people realising that the emperor of international law has no claims.
I think we are.
Trump goes, I don't know what's going to happen in Venezuela. I'm not an expert on Latin American politics. I know even less about the various factions in Caracas. God, I mean, I wish the best for the Venezuelan people. And Maduro was clearly a narco-communist crook, and I would not shed a tear if he dies in a New York prison. But on this side of the pond, we've got our Prime Minister, all of our governments are saying, well, it's, we're not quite sure, did it breach international law or didn't it? It's up to the Americans to decide. You've got pressure from the left wing of the Labour Party to condemn the action. I mean, there's no there on this, is there? I mean, they sent in Delta Force, they lifted a Baden, and, we'll see how the cards fall, but you either basically support that action or you don't. Well, what biblical text is Keir Starmer reaching to before he decides whether he condemns the action or applauds it?
Well, because Starmer, there's an exquisite pleasure, bearing in mind how unpleasant the man is, in watching him being torn apart. I mean, and the fact that it's happening quite slowly makes the pleasure. David Starkey has not entirely forgotten how to be nasty, gives the pleasure. The French used to punish treason by tearing people apart with wild horses who were trained to move slowly. Starmer is being pulled apart between his need to kiss the arse of Donald Trump, which is overwhelming, and on the other hand, the pressure from his backbenchers who believe in this kind of nonsense.
Well, he also believes in his own head, doesn't he?
Well, he sort of does, but I mean, I've come to the conclusion I don't really think Starmer believes in anything, finally. Okay. That there is, I think he is the kind of man who would offer up his wife, if it actually were a matter.
Well, he allowed another man to clothe his wife.
And indeed, the only time we ever seem to see Victoria is when there's a political need to do so, but that's another matter. But we are what we've the really important thing is we have sold ourselves as Europe in general. The EU is all about this. We've all sold ourselves on this view that the world is one that is ruled by law and by regulation. And unfortunately, well, yes, there are rules, yes, there are regulations, yes, you will normally have systems of easy foreign exchange and all the rest of it. But finally, when push comes to shove, if you do not have force, you will be ridden over. I once tried to explain this a few years ago to somebody who's quite well known on the left, a man called Paul Mason, who was suddenly, in the wake of the Ukraine and whatever, rediscovered the need to have proper armed forces. This is back in 2020, before my own cancellation. And I sat down in studio, this is when Andrew Neil was still running his show, and tried to explain to him that might needs, let's get this right. Right needs might. And at which point I was denounced from my page as a fascist. Now, this is complete stupidity, and this is the stupidity of the left, to assume that you can replace the force and power with simply good intentions. And it is yet another catastrophe. But ladies and gentlemen, the whole history of what we've been talking about this evening is a politics of make-believe, a politics of words, a politics of wordplay. We've got to recover reality. Margaret Thatcher was brilliant. She says so clearly, the facts of life are conservative. We've got to recover that.
That is so interesting you say that, because just before I come over to our audience, so again, if you were just framing a question in your mind, allow that to distill, because I'm going to come over to the floor shortly. David, this has been a brilliant analysis of what's gone wrong, how power from our parliament, albeit often exercised by politicians we might not much like, but we can at least get rid of, has gone out of one side of our body to these quangos and out of the other to the judiciary and a very different legal settlement, including that of international law. And we need to somehow get this back. I completely agree with you. Internationally, I think the age of hard power rather than soft power is returning. But here in Britain, what is to be done? So rather than just the analysis of what's gone wrong, a brilliant medical diagnosis of the ills that our country has fallen into, what's your remedy? What medicine is needed? Let's assume an election in, let's say, 2029. I know some people think it might be sooner than that. But the next time we go to elect our parliament in a general election, let's already bake into this premise that the incoming government is very different to this one, perhaps a Reform Party government, perhaps a Reform Conservative coalition, but a group of people, a party or some amalgam that is persuaded by your diagnosis, but now says to you, Dr. Starkey, explain to me the medicine the patient needs and where and how I should wield the scalpel. How do I get it back? How do I make it right? What's your programme for recovery and rehabilitation?
Well, in fact, Reform have already announced this in the person of Danny Kruger in his last major press conference. It is, and I just use a kind of couple of summary terms, I talk about a great repeal and the restoration. I don't want to see a revolution. We don't need a revolution. Broadly, what we need to do is to repeal the major pieces of constitutional legislation of the Blair government, the creation of the Quangos, the incorporation of the ECHR, the Constitutional Reform Act to revert the Supreme Court, to undo the Equality Act, and make that a kind of clean sweep, and to restore the centrality of politics and parliamentary government. That is the basic programme. And it seems to me, particularly with the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch having also committed to the repealing of the ECHR, we're beginning to move to a common programme of the right. But it's that programme of repeal and restoration. That's what we need. And ladies and gentlemen, we've done it twice before. We did it in 1660, which is why I've used the term, the Restoration, when we undid the Cromwellian Protectorate. Remember, it's unique in human history that a country undoes a revolution without foreign intervention and without civil war. It's very, very remarkable. And then the second, of course, is Margaret Thatcher herself. We haven't talked about it, but the great revolution between 1974 and 1979, heralded by Sir Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher's guru, was that he realised that the preceding Conservative governments since 1951 had been a uni-party as well, in exactly the same way that the Cameron, the May, and even the Boris governments were all a continuation of the Blair-Brown years. And in 1979, following Keith Joseph's understanding, they call themselves Conservative, but they haven't been. In 1979, Thatcher undoes. That's what she does. She undoes the settlement of 1945. She undoes the nationalisation of industries. She undoes the uniformity of council housing. She undoes Keynesian economics.
Yep.
And we need a similar undoing, redoing, restoration.
And a reset.
A reset, a genuine reset. Bigger than a reset. I like the word restoration.
Restore. Bring
restore.
back what we used to have.
Exactly.
Get back to what we used to have. David, that's been absolutely fascinating, brilliant. I love the diagnosis and the prescription. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. David Starkey. You okay for water there? So let me tell you how this is going to go. I'm just looking for where the microphones are. We've got handheld mics. You don't need to move. I'm at a slight disadvantage in that I think you can all see David and myself.
Can we bring the house lights up a bit? Is that possible?
But don't worry, that's a little bit better. Now I can see all of you. So let me tell you how this is going to work. I ideally want to take, say, 3 points or questions at a time. You are entitled to ask a very straightforward question, or to make a comment, or to share your thoughts, or even to deliver a lecture. However, it must be no more than 1 sentence in length, and it must end in a question mark. So those are the rules of engagement. And although a good number of you might know each other, I don't know all of you. So if you just don't mind saying who you are, perhaps where you're from, that would be terrific. Can I just see where the mics are? We've got one with Matthew on this side, one with John on that side. I'll take the gentleman in the front row here, then the gentleman in the second row, and then the gentleman in the third row there, Matthew, if you can see him. So, sir, if you don't mind saying who you are and you know the rules.
My name's Richard Carr. I'm a local property developer. I want to start with your first question with regards what did the Tories do with the first 14 years of their rule? They weren't Tories, were they? That's the long and the short of it.
Yeah.
And this brings me into my second question, is that what worries me very much, although I'm a Reform member and quite clearly will be voting Reform in the next general election, do you not think there is a huge danger in too many Conservatives let's call it Mark I Conservatives, joining Reform? I mean, and
We've got the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got the point.
You've got the point.
One sentence.
Then the gentleman, I think there's a gentleman behind you in the second row, and then I'll come over to
We're quite good at censorship. Yes.
David Bourne from Wimborne Minster. I'd like to pick up on your last point, David. Just supposing the likes of Reform were to get in, there is this potential problem, as I see it, of this huge machine called the civil service. How the hell are they going to manage this?
We've got that point too, yeah, thank you.
Brilliant question. Gentleman here, was there?
It was the same question.
Same question. Well done for standing now. So can I go, therefore, to the just on the fourth row here, the one nearest to you, sir? Can I also say I'm a great believer in diversity, equality, and inclusion. So if any women want to ask a question, please put your hand up in the air, sir.
Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. I think it's time we dissolved the universities.
Okay.
Can you give an explanation of the
Right.
things?
Okay, got it.
Okay, so let's go through those, David. First question was the Conservatives were not Conservatives. Essentially, they were Social Democrats in a blue rosette. You've mentioned this continuity, Blair. If there is to be a big reset, and I know you and I discuss, what's the right electoral vehicle? History suggests it's the Conservatives. The opinion polls unambiguously suggest it's Reform. We've seen Nadeem Zahawi, former Conservative Party chairman and Chancellor, defect to Reform today. What's the right balance here? I mean, the first point that the Conservatives weren't Conservatives seems to me to be self-evidently true over the period of office. But does it need the Conservatives to find their soul again? Or is that brand so badly bloodied that actually Reform being kind of clean and clear of it and not having people who are in the senior ministers in this disastrous 14 years, and we just have to find people, pluck them from the street who are going to run the next government? What's your thought on that? What's the right positioning of that?
I don't think there, in the abstract, that there actually is a right or wrong position. I think it will depend on the circumstances of an election. It'll depend on what happens between now and then. It will depend on whether there is a major fiscal crisis, which is perfectly likely. But what I think there has to be a recognition of what has, in fact, been, I would argue, a fundamental problem of conservatism going right back. And here we will do a little bit of more serious history. Conservatism going right back to the beginning. When does the term conservative come into use as a party label? It does so, and it's very appropriate, because the 1830 group is one of our sponsors. It is as a result of 1832, which represented the complete defeat of the old Tory party. And the Conservative leader at the time, Sir Robert Peel, decides you need a new word rather than Tory. So he comes up with the word Conservative in the Tamworth Manifesto of 1835. But remember, Conservatism begins in defeat. It begins as the acceptance of change. Because what Disraeli said, what Peel says in the Tamworth Manifesto, we accept absolutely the first Reform Act. The problem then is, once you've accepted change, where the hell do you stop? And this is again, until you've got some sort of intellectual principle, and for most of its existence, conservatism never had one. And the only Conservative leader who's ever sorted this problem out correctly was Robert Peel's great opponent in the party, that's Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli addresses this exact same issue. He carries out the Second Reform Act of 1867, which he does partly just because he liked playing political games, but also because it's called dishing the Whigs. He spots the fact that the skilled working man who is going to be enfranchised by the Second Reform Act is generally, in most ways, much more conservative than the middle-class liberal businessman. So he plays that game. But he also comes up with a wonderful phrase in his speeches in 1867. And by the way, I hope you've been moderately impressed at how we've all been able to perform with the various liquids in front of us. It is nothing compared with Disraeli and Gladstone. They address audiences of several hundred people in vast buildings with no amplification. You've got shouters at the far margins who were communicating what was being said to the audience below, and with liquid support. Disraeli, in the great speech that I'm going to quote from now, that was given in Edinburgh, 2 hours long, and consumes 2 bottles of brandy during the speech. So I think we've been extraordinarily modest. But Disraeli comes up with this wonderful formula, and listen to it carefully. He says, Britain is a progressive country. In a progressive country, change is inevitable. And if you look in the dictionary of quotations, that's where Disraeli's speech stops. He doesn't. He says, the question is not change, it's what sort of change. Is it change in accordance with the traditions and customs of the country? Good. Is it change in accordance with the abstract principles of international liberalism like Blair or the French Revolution? Bad. And Conservatives need to recover that. We've also, ladies and gentlemen, got to recover something else. New is not always best. What's gone wrong with the universities, and I speak as somebody who spent much of his life in them, is the perpetual cult of novelty. That everything's got to be new, rather than the realization that the fundamental purpose of education is the transmission of a culture from one generation to the next. But that's not something that's dead or deadly. Right at the beginning of our culture, the man who really invents English, which remember is a very recent language, it only goes back to about 1400, Geoffrey Chaucer, at the end of the 14th century, he comes up with this wonderful idea about the nature of change, of culture, and whatever. And he says, just as each year, from the cold, dead ground, and we're in the middle of cold, dead winter, the new corn comes up, so from old books, new knowledge springs. And that should be our relationship with history and tradition. It's the realization that they're not dead ground. They fertilize. They're only dead when you do what Blair did, when you carry out tabula rasa and you run a flamethrower over the past. Then you just get rubbish. Again, look at what Blair did. He plants things, he tears things up by the roots and then is surprised they wither, and then he plants things without fertilizing them. He's astonished that they don't
It's worse than
grow.
that. They poured acid on the ground.
They pour acid on the ground.
So the soil is no longer fertile.
That's right.
Well, I'll come back to David's question in a minute, but you mentioned the universities, David. The provocative question was, Henry VIII, very much your period of history, sack the
By the way, that
monasteries.
was also the origin of Brexit, but there we are, the break with the church, yeah.
Well, if we'd never left the Catholic Church, we would have stayed in the EU, quite possibly. Henry VIII was the first Brexiteer. But the question was, should we now look at the universities in this way? I know it's a slightly tricky question.
I think there's a case for a partial dissolution. I think the fact we've now got 150 universities is preposterous. I think the case for closure. Most of them need to be transformed into local colleges of further education, technical colleges, that sort of thing. Most departments, and I speak of my own subject, most arts departments, I'm afraid, under the current dispensation, are actively damaging.
Didn't answer the question.
Actively damaging.
So you think the first question was not answered?
Yeah, he didn't answer the question about Conservatives going into reform.
Yeah, going into reform. What's the right balance? He said it's very difficult to judge.
I said I don't think there is. I don't think you can say. I don't think you can say it in the abstract. What I think is important: reform needs people with experience of government. The question is whether their experience of government will act as inspiration or as a lead weight. And that will require levels, dare I say it, of personal management skills which Mr. Farage has yet to demonstrate.
David asked about, imagine, I think in your scenario, David, it was a reform majority government, but imagine any government of this ilk with this analysis and this prescription comes to office. The machine is just going to spit you out. Of course.
Yeah.
So, winning the election, majority of 150, I mean, that's the kind of easy part, isn't it?
Very much so.
So how do you make sure that the popular will of the people, if it were to be expressed in that way at the ballot box at the next general election, doesn't just get spat out because the bureaucratic machine, a mixture of civil service, quangocrats, lawfare, God knows what else, prevents it? What's the tactical program to ensure that the democratic
There is
prevails?
only one way, and by the way, you cannot guarantee that you will win. And this is absurd. You cannot predict the future. What you can do, you can work as hard as possible to preempt it. And the model is the difference between Trump's first term and Trump's second term. For Trump's second term, people had done really serious work. A proper team had been assembled. Vast amounts of time and money had been spent on preparing legislation. And what is happening with reform at the moment is the beginnings of this process are taking place. I mean, again, I should really have explained my own position, and I think the same also applies to Mark. We both remain members of the Conservative Party, but we are available and we offer our advice to anybody. In fact, I would offer it to the Labour Party if they were prepared to take it. We are in the middle, we're in a genuine national crisis. We need for everybody of goodwill and who is capable of making a proper contribution to do so. But what my great hope is that if we can, as I said, use policy formation and policy debate and the actual drafting of legislation to bring about a realization that there is much more that we agree about than that we disagree about. And to provide that sort of basis. But once again, I'm under no illusion. There will be profound resistance. There will be, I think, again, without wanting to go into too many details, I think it will be wrong to assume that there will be much ready agreement from Buckingham Palace. I think that there will have to be a very clear understanding that the Lords will have to be whipped into line. If we go back to 1832 or to 1910, huge pressure had to be brought to bear on the House of Lords. That will have to be done again. And so on and so on.
I'm going to come back for some more questions now, but just to go into that sort of how do we win it, what's gone wrong, interesting on Nadeem Zahawi leaving the Conservative Party and joining Reform today. I did listen to his speech live, but I picked out a few of what were the standout quotes. He said, we need a glorious revolution.
Exactly.
He said that the biggest problem in Britain was overpowerful civil servants and quangos. He said that what had been witnessed over the past couple of decades was constitutional vandalism. And
they've all listened to the podcast.
And he and his own party shared some of the blame for that. And he said, our great mission is to correct our failure to take back control over our entrenched unelected bureaucracy and put it back into the hands of Parliament. You can take any view of Nazim Zahawi, but that seems to be a fairly strong sign up to the Starky thesis, I would say. Right, let me take a few more. Look, I'm going to be a bit DEI here. This lady on the front. Let me take 3 questions on the front here, and then I'll go back to you guys on the back of the room over there. So, madam, if you don't mind introducing yourself, 1 sentence, ideally, a couple, and in a question mark.
My name is Betty Harland, and I live in Camford Cliffs. Thank you, gentlemen. Very, very interested evening. As a huge David Cameron fan, do you feel or agree that Boris and Michael Gove ruined the Conservative Party for Mr. Cameron?
OK, I'm going to allow you 1 further sentence to explain why you are a big David Cameron fan.
Have you got a day or 2?
No, you've got a sentence.
Well, I thought as a Tory since the age of 21 years old, and now moved over to Reform, I've always thought the Conservative behaved in a good way and ran the country
So
well.
integrity, it was about his integrity.
Integrity, yes.
Okay.
And I think David Cameron was forced into leaving the Conservative Party, mainly by Boris and Michael Gove.
OK.
OK, come on.
This is going to be an eclectic...
We believe in freedom of debate. Come on.
We're going to go across the front row. Who was next? This gentleman in specs, and then I'll come to you, sir. So you, sir, and then you next.
Hello, Bolton Brown. I live in Leamington.
Sorry, your first name was?
Bolton.
OK.
Thank you. We learn in history how Britain is capable of correcting its mistakes politically or even culturally. When we think about reform, we often hear about reform of the House of Lords as well. Let's go back to Magna Carta and see how power has been flayed away from the King and the Lords over time, little by little, over hundreds of years. Is a solution to this to restore some of the power to the Crown and to the Lords?
OK. Really interesting point. And then the gentleman just next to you, then I'm going to come to the people over there. Sir.
Yes, thanks. Nick Panton. I was a GP in central Bournemouth. My question relates to who's actually going to do the job. And we've heard from Reform, or Nigel in particular, that he's keen on appointing ministers who are not necessarily MPs, but who are experts in their field. And this sort of seems to run into the question of the danger of having experts making the rules. And I'd be interested for your thoughts on that. Thank you. 3
great questions. Let's begin with Betty, David Cameron fan. All opinions welcome. I'd say I know David Cameron a little bit. I'm not particularly hostile to him. But perhaps, David, you can reflect on, I guess, the change of leadership of the Conservative Party over that period of time. So let me add to Betty's analysis, right? You might claim that folk of our ilk led the Conservative Party to continual destruction from 1997 to 2010. And then Cameron, fresh-faced, rather more modern look, perhaps a bit more touchy-feely, but after an extraordinary period of losing elections, he leads the Conservative Party back into government, initially in coalition, but then wins an outright majority 5 years later. In fact, until the Conservative Party left office in 1997, there was only one leader of the Conservative Party who had never become Prime Minister. If you had become leader of the Conservative Party, it was a surefire bet. At some point, you'd be Prime Minister. You might lose 3 elections out of 4, like Ted Heath, but you'd still be Prime Minister. Austin Chamberlain was the only one who did not become Prime Minister. After 97, we get William Hague. He never becomes Prime Minister. Then we get Ian Duncan Smith, he never becomes Prime Minister. Then we get Michael Howard, he never becomes Prime Minister. Suddenly there's 4 Tory leaders in a very short period of time. Fresh-faced, modern, with it, David Cameron comes along, and bang, we're back into office for 14 years. What do you make of that psephological analysis, that electoral history over the success of the Conservative Party electorally?
Well, I suppose there's a short answer to it. It's fine to win an election, but what if you can't do anything Conservative and don't want to do anything Conservative? I think that Cameron's triumph showed the seeds of the catastrophe of 2024. I mean, David Cameron says quite explicitly, and again we can see why. He says in 2005, when he's elected, he wants a Conservative Party where Liberals will feel happy. But the problem is, you don't do anything Conservative. And you are, in fact, simply... He says he's an heir to Blair. But we've been here before. If we look at the period from 1951 onwards, beginning with Churchill himself, none of them undo what Attlee did. And that's a disaster. The real seeds of Britain's disaster are 1945, the determination to build an unfunded welfare state and a free at the point of use NHS on a completely ruined and indebted wartime economy. It was insane. It was completely insane. And we've never really recovered from that. And Churchill knew, I mean, if you read Churchill's manifesto, in 45, he understood completely that we were facing genuine socialism.
But then decided to go along with the
But then in 51,
proposition.
He's old, he's tired, he's pissed, and does nothing about it.
Yeah.
Nothing
wrong with being old, tired, and pissed, by the way.
It is true. I mean, we must acknowledge these things. And then, of course, you come up with something else in exactly the same way that the true charge that the Conservatives and Labour became the uniparty from 2010 onwards. In the same way, after 1951, there was a term Butskellism from Hugh Gateskill, who, of course, leader of the Labour Party, who didn't become Prime Minister, Winchester, good public school boy, R.A. Butler on the part of the Tories, who'd only been to Marlborough, but there we are, we can't all have everything. And the two of them had basically the same economic and social policies.
And we've actually seen that recreated again quite recently, haven't we? It's very difficult to distinguish Cameron from Blair. Or, yeah, I mean, the blue and the red seem to merge in together until recently, you might say.
Even over Brexit.
Yeah.
You look at Theresa May. I mean, well, exactly. That's my feeling too. She's busy now ruining a London club. Everybody's fleeing from the Athenaeum in their droves, you know. But she and Brenda Hale run it. Can you imagine a worse mixture? But there we are. But Theresa May again. You know, under Theresa May, you finally get non-crime hate incidents. Under Tories, you get the beginning of gender self-identification for transsexualism. And what on earth? We get Cameron. Look, I'm gay, but the idea that Cameron says his principal achievement is gay marriage for a Conservative, this seems to me to be demented. It's simply silly.
That might be something that you would want to do, but for it to be your principal achievement is the demented thing.
But it's a principal achievement of the Conservative
So
government.
I just wonder, let me just explore this just a tad further. Do you think Brexit, or you know, the question of our relationship with the European Union, had to eventually redefine the Conservative Party? And you had clearly, you know, two wings about this forever and a day. I mean, you can go all the way back to Enoch Powell and Ted Heath, Macmillan being rebuffed by de Gaulle. The Conservative and Unionist Party, you know, couldn't work out whether it wished to be part of this. You can go back to Churchill.
And nor indeed could Labour.
Nor indeed could Labour. But from the right side of the ledger, if we're trying to look at the political parties and forces that might be on our side, this question has particularly bedeviled the Conservative Party, right? In that the Labour Party has changed its mind, but it has always been decisive when doing so. whereas at the time of the 2016 referendum, the Conservative Party would have been the most divided of all of the major parties in Britain, right? You know where UKIP stands, you know where the Liberal Democrat stands, the Conservative Party, I don't know, roughly split 50-50. And therefore, this sort of issue of, do you see our constitutional future being wrapped in with Europe, yes or no? Presumably that has now been decided, right? I mean, after a long, lengthy battle. And one faction of the Conservative Party has therefore triumphed. It wasn't David Cameron's position, it wasn't Theresa May's position. It was Johnson's and Gove's position. But at some point, political parties need to go through that trauma and catharsis, and then you come out the other end. A bit like the Conservatives being, for the Corn Laws, and then ending up as a free trade party. You know, one side eventually wins.
And being put on the rack over tariffs.
Yeah, for example. So do you think that potentially now resets the Conservative Party? Put aside, I mean, I was for leave, but I think there are sincere people on the centre-right who have remained. I don't believe that was a ludicrous argument. It was an argument I was against, but I believe it could be sincerely put. But do you think that can now be put to bed after what was probably from, I don't know, certainly Maastricht onwards, which was 1992, I think, sort of 30, a generation and a half of divide about this. Has that now been won for the Leave side, and now we can get around that? I.e., there are no Tory rejoiners, are there, to speak of?
Probably not. But you see, I think in most ways, the debate over Europe was actually a proxy debate about what actually conservatism was.
Yeah.
And it's also a proxy debate about the crisis that I've been trying to describe. I mean, if you look at the slogan, "Take Back Control," you could use exactly that same slogan.
For the Starky thesis.
For the Starky thesis. And I think that what the Leave argument got wrong was it assumed, and why, in a sense, Brexit seems so disappointing, apart from the fact we all know the problems of getting the I mean, we were talking about the problems of persuading the political establishment to do something it doesn't want to do. The whole Brexit thing offers you a kind of dress rehearsal of what a reform government will actually have to face. But I think the fundamental problem was that the Leave arguments assumed that the problems of lack of control, of expert governance, of alien laws were all over there in Europe. They weren't here. In fact, the real problems were here all along. And Europe represented, well, yes, it was part of the same process, and indeed the seed of so much of what I've been talking about has been sown in Europe by the broad ideas of the European Union and so on. Which
is very much founded in international liberalism.
Which was
Disraeli would have hated it.
Would have hated it. On the other hand, if you think of that one streak of conservatism, which was the free market streak, was the predominance of free trade and the economy and all the rest of it, then you can see that it is indeed part of an authentic conservative tradition. But it's one that ignores, again, Disraeli, a conservative party is a national party or it's nothing. And you see, this seems to me, we've been talking about so many things. I think I need to come back and just emphasize this. What we can see from Trump in particular, and what we can see from every successful government, be it Poland, be it Orbán, be it Netanyahu, there has to be a clear sense that a government has one single overriding responsibility. It is to its own nation and to its own people. You are not part of a broad enterprise for general human betterment. And of course, the left is completely lost in that idea, and indeed sees the pursuit of the national interest as vulgar, as detrimental. We've got to recover it, because again, of course, what we've done is to sacrifice for utter trivialities like special educational needs, the fundamentals of justice and defence. And that's what government is about. It's the maintenance of domestic law and order and defence against the enemies of the state. And I'm afraid we have internal and external enemies who will force that truth on us if we don't recognise it ourselves.
Now, I was fascinated by this question about a restoration, that, David, you're a bit of a dangerous pinko liberal, handing over all the power to the House of Commons. I mean, isn't a proper restoration to hand a bit more power back to the House of Windsor or the House of Lords? Why are we placing all of our faith in the post-1830...
Right.
Why not go back to 1831?
Why not go back to 1831 when it means we've got to go through 1832 all again, which I'm not terribly keen on doing. I think, right, let me say where I think you're making some very important points. I think the late Queen took a series of disastrous decisions in effectively abandoning the political role of the monarchy. We can see the idolisation of the Queen is a profound error. She is above all responsible with her worship of the Commonwealth for the fact that the monarchy has found itself aligned with multiculturalism and everything else. So I think we've got to start to take a much cooler view of her reign, and her decision largely to pull out of the political process after the crisis of the succession to Harold Macmillan, I think is a deeply dangerous and regressive one. And if you look at and remember, all the highly successful continental monarchies, the monarch plays a significant part in the political process. I mean, one of my favourite memories, I happened by complete accident to be on reasonably nodding terms with Queen Emeritus, I never thought, Emerita, I better say, Queen Margaret of Denmark. And I enjoyed one memorable occasion with her when I got to know her really quite well. And she was suffering from an extremely unregal bad cold, and had a box of fags on one side of the fender and a box of tissues on the other, and a nose like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in between. And I dared to ask her what had she most enjoyed about being Queen, and it was and then she said carpentry. I thought, dear God. I mean, she's very interested in stage design, costume design, what's called découpage, which is cutting out things and whatever. And she laughed at me and said making and breaking cabinets.
Ah, very clever. Very clever. Very clever.
Because, of course, as the Queen, under the 1832 conventions, you manage the political process. And we can see now we need somebody to manage the political process. Nobody trusts the Speaker. He's a dimwit anyway. And we desperately need somebody to be doing that. And with the kind of crises that we're going to be facing now. And again, I worry deeply that the King has embraced what are now deeply political causes, like global warming. This is deeply political. The Prince of Wales still more so. But we are a country that is founded on a monarchy, and all the really stable countries of Europe are monarchies. France isn't stable for a second with the catastrophe of the revolution. So I'm in favour of a proper royal restoration, but it would require abandonment of the idea that monarchy is all about espousing funny causes. That's not what it should be about, and it's an absurdity. I would also like to see a stronger representation of the landed interest in the upper house. I think certainly the presence of I'd be truthful. I'd choose them on the grounds of the richest of the peers. I think 20 of those will be a highly useful corrective. I also believe that we need to recover a notion of continuity and historical continuity in our government. I take seriously that a family like the Cecils or a family like the Russells knock spots off the House of Windsor in terms of the manners, their association with English history. I think this matters. They mustn't have the overweening power that they used to have, but we're not talking about that. I also think that we need, and the mess that I've just seen in Bournemouth drives this point home, the sheer uglification of our country. This fact of deterioration, disintegration, hideous street furniture, abandonment of buildings, graffiti. It produces an awful incipient sense of Mogadishu creeping over Britain. And it's something I hate. And once again, those who've guarded their inheritances, those who've guarded these magnificent estates and houses, have had the taste and the wisdom to do it. I'd like to see them play a bigger role.
Nick's question, this is an interesting one, and I'm going to add my supplementary to it. His question was very straightforward. Who is going to do the job? So here's a bit of a worry that I've got about how Nigel Farage and Reform might approach this. I'll give a little bit of recent political history about it. It sort of goes like this. We're going to bring in businessmen and experts from the outside.
But we know have always done so wonderfully.
Yeah, but I mean, you might, for example, I mean, this is hypothetical. I don't think it's. You might, for example, have been able to run a very successful airline. You've been the former chief executive of British Airways or Virgin Atlantic or whatever. This does not necessarily mean you will be a good minister for transport. You may have run a great chain of restaurants and got hugely rich about it. That does not mean you're going to be a good minister for food. You may have run a fantastic hotel chain like Rocco Forte. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the best minister for tourism. And actually, in quite recent memory, a brilliant man, an absolutely brilliant man, Archie Norman, who was the chairman, was he, or the chief executive of Asda, I think it was. I mean, absolutely brilliant in that role. But in politics, he just couldn't land it. It's a totally different skill set. So Nick's question with my supplementary, I think, is even more apposite. You know, who's going to do the job? That you're going to need a prime minister, a cabinet of at least a dozen.
No.
Well, okay, maybe fewer. But you're going to need to police these ministries. I mean, at the moment, there's, 100 ministers, something like that. There are special advisors, there are senior civil servants. There was a great Spectator podcast about this, that the sort of total personnel you need to run a government at a political level, forget the functionaries, forget, Mary in accounts or, Bill the legal officer, 2,000 or 3,000 people, something like that. Reform just doesn't have enough politicians, does it?
No, it doesn't. I think equally, we need an urgent program of proper training. I mean, one of the ways in which the French have been, in many ways, much better governed than we've been since the Second World War is they founded ENA, the National School of Administration, and every senior French politician and administrator and businessman has been there. And I think there's a very sound case. I mean, people.
But we need to do this in 3 years.
Not everything can be done at once. This is going to. The ship of state is a gigantic tanker, turning it round. The best we can hope for is a decent beginning. But that equally, what is important is simply what Trump has been able to do. The sense that action is possible. That we're in a world where it seems that nothing can actually be, in this country, where nothing can actually be done. There has to be a recovery of that sense, yes, it is possible to do something. And that's the we can hope for more, but that's the basics we've got.
Get that one ticks off first.
Get that right first. And there are all sorts of very good things going on at the moment. There are groups in Oxford with good seed money, some of it American, some of it British, particularly coming from the world of high tech and whatever, that are training groups of very, very able young people unusually on the right politically, the kind of people who will go immediately into middling to middling senior positions in the civil service. That's already in hand. We hope more money will be devoted to it. And again, once the process starts to happen,
snowball effect.
It snowballs. It snowballs. And again, I think one of the things that I would also like to say, it is perfectly clear at the moment we suffer from far too much government, or far too much quasi-government. And the return of huge swathes of decision-making to local level and whatever seems to me to be an obvious solution to so much of this. Government is trying to do far, far too much and doing it all badly.
Yeah.
All badly.
I'm going to take 3 more questions. So, Madam.
Thank you. Jo Keeling, not business person, ex-police officer. Don't hold that against me. You spoke about Margaret Thatcher and how she fundamentally changed the direction of Britain, not just in policy, but also in mindset. Do you believe there's anyone currently in any political party who's capable of doing that, and what qualities should they have?
Excellent question, and thanks for being so succinct. I've now lost my second. This gentleman here, sir.
Yeah, good evening. My name's Andrew Wade. I'm from Warwickshire, looking to stand at the next election. A lot of people are furious about the size of the welfare state, most definitely because in the last 5 years, PIP claims have gone up from 2 million to 3.4 million, and 70% of those claims are for invisible diseases. A lot of people I know would like that the DWP said tomorrow, all people claiming benefits who are physically able to work should do community service, such as litter picking, graffiti clearing, so you would have seen Bournemouth better. Could the DWP put that into action tomorrow, or would we have to revoke Article 4.2 of the Human Rights Act 1998 to actually get it done and reduce the benefits bill immediately?
Just tell us what Article 4.2 is that might be a barrier.
Article 4.2 of the Human Rights Act is against enforced labour. So obviously in 1950 it was done because you had people, interns at Auschwitz, working in the IG Farben factory down the road making Cyclone B, Jews working in Mauthausen in the quarry. But does that... I mean, to me, that isn't... You can't compare that with asking someone on benefits to go litter picking.
Thank you for the clarification. And then there's a gentleman a couple of rows back. You, sir, final question.
Oh, hello. I'm Mark. I was originally born in London, moved to Bournemouth a few years ago. My question is, St Margaret of Grantham, she changed the country back the way it should be, but she couldn't do everything at once. We all know that. So she set her priorities. So based on the fact that we've got most of our, if not all of our institutions that are actually being captured by the Blairite left. Where do we start? What are the priorities? What's number one, number two, etc.?
Got it. So, David, let's start with Jackie's question, which is quite interesting about, I mean, two of our questioners are focused on Margaret Thatcher. That it wasn't just sort of, well, that was quite a good delivery. You managed to sort of beat Arthur Scargill and to reset and restore the commanding heights of the economy are no longer going to be nationalised, an incredible privatisation programme, generally speaking, a deregulation programme. But it wasn't just about the execution of policy, I think Jackie was saying. It was about the mindset changed. People started calling themselves Thatcherites, right? Very few people call themselves Haygites or Starmerites or Brownites. You know, I mean, it was a movement that wasn't just about executing policy. Who do you pick out today who might have that same ability? That was basically the question, right?
Well, I suppose the short answer is there is nobody yet visible. Maybe, again, if we have somebody like Farage who espouses something like the programme that I'm talking about. In other words, what was remarkable about Thatcher was that we knew, even though, as other people were saying, it took her a long. In fact, the last question that she didn't try and do everything at once, and there was a clear dependence on events, on the additional confidence that's given by the Falklands and all the rest of it. But what was very clear from the beginning was that there was a direction of travel, that there was going to be a change.
And it was coherent.
And that it was, there was a coherence about it. That hasn't yet happened. That hasn't yet happened. But you know, we're at the very beginning of this process. I mean, if you think about Thatcher, the Thatcher before 1974, the Thatcher before 1974 was the most enthusiastic abolisher of grammar schools. You know, she was in many ways our worst Secretary of State for Education. Keith Joseph, again, he says himself, he was fully signed up to the Heathite programme. From 74 onwards, there's this incredible intellectual reconstruction of people of the highest talents, Keith Joseph, Hoskins, the whole of the IEA, the whole of the newly founded Centre for Policy Studies and so on, all of them working furiously. We've barely started. It takes time. And do
you think cometh the hour, cometh the man?
Well, it depends. Nobody really thought...
Or the woman.
Nobody at the time thought Thatcher was up to much. I remember we all laughed our heads off, those silly pussy bows, the shrieky voice. She had... look at how she's reinvented.
Would that be the same as Kemi then?
Pardon?
Kemi Badenoch might tick that box.
Yes, I think there'd be more reinvention, is my own view, but... without wishing to betray too many feelings, but yeah. But it is possible. We don't know. We really don't know. Nobody thought Blair had it in him.
Yeah.
You know, he was
Churchill, even.
Indeed, Churchill. But Blair was widely mocked as Bambi.
Yeah.
Widely mocked as Bambi.
Let me then take Mark's question next, which was St Margaret of Grantham, where do we start? And again, let me add my addendum to this, my supplementary, I suppose it is. I don't know whether this was philosophically a success of Thatcherism, but my God, she was good at picking her battles, right? So we look at the things that she successfully did, like putting the trade unions back in their box, liberalising the economy, economic growth comes back, entrepreneurialism comes back. However, she didn't, for example, touch the BBC.
Or the entire structure of the welfare state.
Or the NHS. She didn't touch the Royal Mail because it had the word royal in it, that apparently there needed to be a nationalised industry to move papers from position A to position B. You would have thought that would be one of the most obvious things to privatise. But nevertheless, there's a certain genius here about how much bandwidth can you spend. And if you're spending all of your bandwidth on trade union reform for sake of argument or lower taxes for sake of argument, you can't then open up another front on reform of the NHS or the Royal Mail or the BBC. But Mark's question was, where do we start? I suspect your answer is going to be a bit meta, isn't it? That if we get the constitutional structure right, then secondary to that, we'll work out which policy battles we win. But is there any... Do you want to give any guidance about sort of, that's irritating, but don't worry about it. You know, we'll deal with that in our fourth term in office. Whereas this is absolutely urgent and has to be dealt with within the first 72 hours.
I don't think anybody imagines that you can simply dissolve 400-odd quangos on day one. That would be silly. But I think that what you need to... There's a great difference from the world that Thatcher found. That you could demolish piecemeal nationalised industry by nationalised industry. You could undo bits of trade union legislation piece by piece.
Yeah.
You could have a dramatic set too with the miners, which you deliberately avoid in your first term. Once you've actually planned, once you've got David Hart doing the dirty work.
And NACOD's on side.
And laying up stocks of coal in power stations and all the rest of it. I think we are in a very different position now, because the heart of the Blairite project is mutually reinforcing. The thing that's the key to understanding the disaster we're in now is entrenched in law. But the great advantage is, the one thing Parliament can really do is repeal law. And I think that there would need, which is why I put my emphasis on the Great Repeal, I think there would need to be a swift, brutal, and absolutely coherent programme of repeal. And that indeed, if you don't do it, this thing is a hydra. So if you don't strike these things down, the various bits of them will all come to each other's defence.
You've got to shoot it in the heart, not cut off a head.
You've got to cut all the heads off at once.
Yeah.
But as I said, there's no point in worrying too much about Department 3.4 of English Heritage.
Yeah.
You'll need to sort it out eventually. Or indeed, doing the Henry VIII on all the universities. Henry VIII, remember, dissolved the monasteries and the chantries stage by stage, if I recall my distant memories of that particular feature of the reign.
Now, I want to finish, therefore, on Andrew's question, which I guess, David, is more in my sphere. It's about economics, really, the welfare state, although Andrew mentioned that there could be legal things that stand in the way. Look, I mean, on the economic side of the ledger, which, let's be honest, is a pretty massive one, welfare spending is the big out-of-control expenditure here, right? And I don't think, and I'm actually would applaud both Reform and the Conservative Party for starting to realise this, that we're not going to be able to balance the budget just by getting rid of rainbow lanyards and procuring paper clips more cheaply than the NHS.
The whole Doge programme was an absurdity.
There are savings to be made. You know, I mean, it shouldn't cost £100 to replace a light bulb in a hospital, but nevertheless, these are fairly. This is small beer compared to the big items of expenditure. So, if you were to add up on the government's expenditure side of the ledger, welfare spending, and by that I just mean taking money from one cohort and giving it to another, literally churning around cash. We're going to, here's some money because you can't afford a house, here's some money because you've got a range of kids, here's some money because you need support for housing. Literally issuing cheques, that's what I call the welfare state. Health and education, the NHS and state education, that is getting on to now 2/3 of the government budget, right? So yeah, you can close down the Arts Council, and I would, but it's not going to touch the sides of the deficit. And welfare is the biggest expenditure item now, literally giving money to people for one criteria or another. Now, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I do want there to be a safety net. And Andrew's suggestion, again, Andrew, tell me if I'm exaggerating this somewhat, is to make there be some social contract here for those who are receiving money of working age, to say, right, well, here is your housing benefit or your child benefit or whatever, or universal credit or whatever it might be. But in return for that, the state requires this of you, right? He was worried that it might include slavery. I don't think it does. My role model here, and no doubt because Andrew asked the question, he might be across it, was Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin. So this is going back 20 years now. They reformed the welfare state in Wisconsin by saying, we're not going to cut your benefits. I'm going to paraphrase, it was a bit more complicated than this, but we're not going to cut your benefits at all. But if you're of working age and are just saying, I'm looking for a job but I can't find one, guess what? We'll give you one. And you will have to turn up at the park gates at 8 o'clock every morning, and you will be scrubbing down graffiti, picking up litter or whatever. Fairly boring, but a contribution to the community. And they assumed that this would lead to enormously cleaner parks with much less graffiti around. And again, I'm paraphrasing here a bit, on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, loads of people turned up at the park gates because otherwise they were going to lose their welfare pay. A few weeks later, nobody was turning up. They weren't getting their welfare checks. Guess what? They decided it was preferable to go and work in a bar or a restaurant or a hairdresser, because you are now having to actually do something to earn your keep. So they surrendered their welfare and decided, rather than having to pick up litter in the park for 10 hours a week, I'd rather be a taxi driver or whatever it might be. So the scheme, if you like, on total numbers participating, failed because it was so successful that it forced people into the private sector. So I guess on Andrew's point was community service. Obviously national service is an issue that comes up a lot. Should there be a quid pro quo on this welfare? Now, my worry about it is that now so much of the welfare is based around not, I can't find a job. That was 1980s style welfare. It's now, I can't work because I've got ADHD, autism, depression, acne, God only knows what. But that, in concept, do you think there might be a bigger role for the state to say, well, we're going to give you welfare, but the flip side is you're going to have to do this for the state?
You see, I would take a radically different approach. The Victorians addressed all these problems. They understood
themselves,
them.
without the state.
The Victorians had 2 essential criteria with welfare. The first was welfare payments should not be given to people in work. It's absurd that the state subsidises employment. That was the abolition of the so-called Speenham land system. And the second, and it's brutal, but I think it's necessary, welfare should never be below the level of the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. Ever, under any circumstances. Now, it sounds brutal, but I think the only way...
It should never be above minimum wage levels.
It should never be above... It should be never above a subsistence wage. Never above... And, of course, the minimum wage constantly keeps being lifted up with fatal... But it should never be above a level of subsistence.
Yeah.
And I think...
Well, intriguingly, Beveridge says this in the Beveridge report.
But that's because
welfare should be at subsistence levels.
Because he's reflecting the Victorian tradition, which was deliberately, which we have deliberately destroyed. I mean, I think the truth is plain, isn't it? If people can get something for nothing, they will. And if it's also, you have societies where there is not a tradition of ordinary employment. If you bring people from rural peasant areas, there isn't a tradition of continuous working. That's not what you do. Mm-hmm. Is it surprising when you suddenly go into a land of milk and honey, where if you put up a performance, you're actually given a cheque every week?
But we have this as an indigenous problem in various parts of the UK now. We've got third generation of welfare claimants.
People have lost the habit of working.
Yeah.
And again, redoubled by the catastrophe of furlough.
Yeah.
And I suspect, I'm afraid, that to sort this out, there will be need for severe means. But you know, we are going to be, and we haven't talked about this, and bearing in mind the introduction, the 1832 background perhaps we should have done. I think we will face, in the not very distant future, a massive fiscal crisis in which we will be forced to make cuts. I really do think that will happen. And you know, if you remember what happens in Greece and Ireland, it's 20% cuts across the board.
Yeah.
You know, there will be something like that.
So we are better to get ourselves back in shape
much better to get
before the
ourselves
surgeon forces some unpleasant surgery.
I'm afraid that's right.
The Conservatives brought in PPE.
Yeah, the Conservatives made a whole range of catastrophic errors for which...
we are not denying it. I mean, quite the opposite. And in fact, I think that the Conservative Party will never recover a moral standing until it admits what went wrong. Pardon? Sorry?
Well, you best you join Reform.
No, because I prefer I'm a believer in the continuity of institutions and traditions. I think that eventually what will happen here will be some variant of what happened in Canada. there will be a reconstituted Conservative Party.
There'll be a realignment on the right.
There'll be a realignment on the right, is what's going to happen. But I'm relatively, how can I say, I'm relatively open-minded about the actual form that it may take.
But it needs to take some form. Ladies and gentlemen, we've probably overridden our time. It's the job of the BBC to educate, entertain and inform you, but I hope that myself and David have done that, and we don't charge you £187 per annum under criminal penalty for doing so. So thank you for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it. But my biggest thanks to, we can come here and shoot the breeze, but my huge thanks to Matthew in 1832 for putting the whole meeting on, because if he'd not done that, this wouldn't have happened at all. So to wrap up our proceedings, Matthew.
Brilliant. Wow. Was that good? A huge amount of informative information there. I mean, I'm much more educated now. Thank you very much. Some great questions as well. And I can't think of two people in our system who are better to put those kind of questions to than these two gentlemen here. But before I finally thank them, please go on to the 1832 website, have a look at what we're about and join. Please join, please follow the movement. We are about affecting change and doing all the things that these gentlemen have been talking about tonight. Stay with us. We're going to be going to the bar. Please stay with us because you're buying, hopefully. I drink cider, just mentioning. But thank you very much, and enormous thank you to these two gentlemen, Dr. David Starkey and Mark Littlewood. A huge round of applause. Thank you very much.